I'm really delighted to be here, and I can't wait to see the exhibit and this extended symposium on the art and life of Maynard Dixon. I want to thank Ken Harvitson, professor of art history here at BYU and also a curator. And I want to thank Dana, both of you, for inviting me to participate. And I really look forward to talking to the rest of you over the next couple of days about Maynard Dixon and hopefully some of the issues and ideas that I'm going to talk about this morning. Last fall, I watched The English. Anybody else? Anybody? Okay. A revisionist Western drama on Amazon Prime, starring British actress Emily Blunt and Lakota Sioux actor Cheske Spencer. Set in 1890, the 6-episode miniseries centers on a wealthy English woman, Lady Cornelia Locke, who travels to Wyoming to avenge her rape and the death of her only son. Early in her journey, she meets Sergeant Eli Whipp, a Pawnee and former scout for the U.S. Cavalry who is on his way to Nebraska to recover ancestral lands seized by whites bearing homestead claims. Traveling together through a cinematic American West, let me go back one, of grassy plains, desolate outposts, greedy criminals, diabolic villains, brutal violence, and technicolor sunsets. Lady Cornelia and Sergeant Whipp fight bad guys with a bow and a rifle and search for their different visions of justice. I was struck by how the moody, color-saturated landscapes, the wide-angled shots of the vast prairies, and the carefully staged scenes of horses and ranches and picturesque mesas all seemed right out of the Maynard Dixon playbook. Indeed, Dixon's bold colors and simplified yet imposing compositions were no doubt an influence on film director Hugo Blick's spare script and stylized depiction of a blood-drenched American West. Born in Henley-on-Thames, west of London, the English director was packed off to a Montana ranch when he was a kid, where he learned, he told a reporter recently, how to hunt, how to shoot, and how to spin a horse. Growing up on a ranch near Fresno, Maynard Dixon learned much the same. This is one of his earliest sketches, dating to 1893. But filmmaker Blick's subversive take on American history and on the American West, and his film's focus on a compelling female protagonist, and on a Native American actually played by a Native American, is the mark of our age, not his. Maynard Dixon's West was a masculine West. From his earliest illustrations of men and bears and guns, all commercial assignments commissioned for magazines including Overland Monthly and Sunset, both of them published on the West Coast, to his last major public mural project, Palomino Ponies, 1840, which was a New Deal section of fine arts mural painted for the Canoga Park, California post office, and painted in 1942. Dixon pictured the American West as a place of masculine action and adventure, a space occupied, managed, and exploited by men. So in today's talk, I'd like to trace some of the sources and styles that shaped Dixon's masculinist take on the American West, focusing especially on his work in commercial illustration and also on the emergence of the genre of the Western in 19th century literature and in art and in film. I hope to further touch on Dixon's own ambivalence and even uncertainty about the American West. An ambivalence driven by his repeatedly stated desire to depict the real West, and I note that several of the titles for the papers over the next couple of days have that word real in it, because it comes from a particular quote that I'll read in a minute. So his repeatedly stated desire to paint the real West and his idealization of a mythical West of independent men, unbeholden to modern and corporate interest. Now, That is not to say that Dixon entirely avoided or evaded women in his pictures of the American West. During the years he was married to photographer Dorothea Lange, for example, from 1920 to 1935, he painted occasional female subjects, including this portrait, which is located in the museum here. But driving with Lange and their two young sons through the Southwest in 1932, Dixon related that he was genuinely and deeply stirred by scenes of homeless, unemployed white men along the roads. Soon thereafter, back in his studio in San Francisco, he embarked on a series of forgotten men paintings, including this view of a dejected young working-class man, identified by his scuffed-up shoes, his white t-shirt, and his dusty jacket. You can sort of see dust on the upper part of his lapels. Sitting on a street curb, inches away from a fire hydrant. And it looks rather cleaned up, but imagine doing this, and imagine sitting on a street curb. His left leg is awkwardly thrust into the street and our vantage point, so it grabs us, and it appears stiff and vulnerable. His back is turned on a sidewalk, bustling with the purposeful legs of men and several women, salaried professionals, not working class, all going somewhere, doing something, and passing him by. John Ott describes the downcast figure on the curb as an emblem of impotence, sunk so low that he sags in a spot where dogs mark their territory. And I think you get his drift. Other paintings in this series, many of them eventually purchased by BYU, gave the forgotten man more physical agency, showing them on the road, treading forth or taking a break, as we see on the bottom right. Note that each of them carries all that they have, a bedroll, a blanket, in a sack, or what was called a bindle, hence the term bindlestiff for the hobos or migratory workers who roamed the country during the Great Depression. The titles of these paintings, No Place to Go, Destination Nowhere, are bleak, and the figures themselves are transient, homeless Americans moving through the West in search of something else, somewhere else. Dixon, I think, interprets their transience, their dispossession, and their alienation from the Western landscape as a sign of the overall emasculation of the American West, the result of the supposed closure of the frontier, according to historian Frederick Jackson Turner and his much-discussed thesis of 1893, the fencing in of formerly open lands, and the shift from an imaginary landscape of individual, independent, masculine workers to a corporate economy of technologies and technocracies dedicated to institutional utility and profit. Dixon described this clash between these Western interests, these various Western interests, and these various Western imaginaries in a series of paintings that depicted the 1934 longshoremen's strike. This was when 12,000 West Coast dock workers from Alaska to San Diego went on strike for 83 days, demanding better working conditions and hiring and the right to organize, and also the right to hire the folks that they wanted to hire along the docks. Shipping bosses responded by recruiting scabs and hiring private security guards, and the strike was marked by repeated instances of police brutality and violence, resulting in the death of 9 strikers. Shipping owners eventually conceded, resulting in the important unionization of all West Coast ports in the United States and setting off the rise of industrial unionization throughout the rest of the 30s and into the 1940s. Dixon's paintings capture the violence and the tension of the 1934 strike, but they fail to address how and why labor conflict was as endemic on the West Coast as it was in Chicago and Detroit and New Jersey, or the fact that the modern industrial workplace, so we can imagine factories, scientific systems of management, assembly lines, speed-ups, sweatshops, and mass production. All of that was as common in California as it was in New York. Dixon's pictures, Ott points out again, allude in only the most indirect way to the shipping companies against which the strikers picket, or the corporate interests that they were actually challenging. Dixon's paintings of the American West, Forgotten Men, and its urban working class were something of a departure from his usual style, one Art Digest critic pointed out in 1936, and I think that was sort of a snarky comment. But a few years later, another Art Digest critic wrote that Dixon's pictorial descriptions of the prevalent California scenes of migratory workers, Dust Bowl refugees, and Bindlestiffs were in fact as typical Western figures today as the frontier and cowboy characters of earlier and more romantic days. So there's this idea going on, there's a shift actually from an earlier understanding of the West to what the West is. Indeed, Dorothy Lang's photographs, John Steinbeck's novels, and Dixon's paintings of homeless men on the road all contributed to changed understandings of the American West in the 1930s, countering the myth and the identity of a Wild West of cowboys and Indians with images of the poverty and desolation that the West experienced as much as other American regions during the Great Depression. Dixon wrestled with the myth and reality and the myth and identity of the American West throughout his career, shrinking, enlarging, and shifting its scope and its meaning depending on his personal interest, his personal needs, and the requirements of his patrons. His work, I think, is perhaps most accurately situated or located between 19th century artists such as Frederick Remington, Charles Russell, and Charles Schrevogel, whose work on the American West helped shape and direct the myth of the Wild West in the American imagination. And 20th century moderns like Walt Kuhn, who interpreted and deconstructed that myth of the American West. From 1918 to 1923, for example, Kuhn worked on this series of 29 small paintings in what he called an imaginary history of the West, each panel reconsidering Western myths and symbols in different modernist styles. Art collector and occasional critic John Quinn called Kuhn's visual assessment absolutely impossible and unreal in an attempt at the scientific diagnosis of what were still prevalent and still dominating myths about the American West. Dixon, by contrast, leaned hard on a masculine Western character, honed in book covers, magazine illustrations, mural studies, advertising commissions, oil paintings, and other visual media. Dixon's pictures focused on the labor, stoicism, and skill of cowboys and the spiritualized silence of Native Americans, seen here in the canvases, The Ancient and Earth Knower. The masculine West that he visualized was, in one way, an extension of the masculine West depicted in dime novels and stories, which I'll talk about in just a minute, since the mid-19th century, and in movies since 1900. And we recognize, of course, John Wayne on the right, and Overland Kits on the left, sort of an early Kit Carson boys story. It was, of course, also an extension of the masculine West depicted in the last quarter of the 19th century by Remington and Russell and Schrevogel, all of whose prolific visual records of hard writing and hard fighting focused on the drama and conflict, which they perceived as the essence of frontier life. So drama, conflict, confrontation, that for them summarized what the West was all about. From the mid-1880s, 1886 as a matter of fact, to his death in 1909, Remington churned out over 3,000 pictures, almost all of them Western subjects engaged in masculine physical action, fighting, struggling, and a good deal of suspense. Compelled by studying his illustrations in Harper's Weekly and in other magazines, Dixon reached out to Remington in 1891, sending him a package of his youthful sketches of California ranch life and asking for some feedback. Much of Dixon's earliest work was destroyed in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, so I'm showing you here drawings that date to after the time period that he sent his drawings to Remington, but I think this gives us a good idea of just how talented and skillful he really was. This is he had been to no art schools at this point. Remington was impressed, telling Dixon, "You draw better at your age than I did at the same age," which is kind of amazing, and telling him to continue to draw, draw, draw. He also added in his letter, which is published in one of Donald Haggerty's books, "To be a successful illustrator is to be fully as much of a man as it is to be a successful painter." Inspired by Remington's advice about how to be an artist and how to be a man, Dixon vowed to devote his artistic career to depicting the American West. In 1893, at age 18, his first Western-themed drawings appeared in Overland Monthly, a San Francisco-based literary and cultural magazine. And here we see 2 of the 6 illustrations that he did for a storyline on the Indian Wars in Utah. And I gotta say, I love Google Books. You can find so much stuff, pull it down, It would have been really hard to find some of the material that I'm going to show today, even 2 decades ago. They're not great images, but it does help to sort of suggest just how much work Dixon actually produced in this medium. In 1893, he received his only formal art training, 3 months at the California School of Design in San Francisco. By 1895, Dixon had wholly adopted the persona of the Western American artist, wearing a Stetson and chaps, with high-heeled cowboy boots with spurs, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, and signing his work with a stylized Thunderbird logo. Isabel Porter Collins captured that image in her San Francisco photography studio, showing Dixon, cigarette in hand, leaning into a mounted saddle, studio prop, and glancing at her and at us with this slightly bemused expression on his face. By 1895, Dixon was designing covers for Overland Monthly and was also working as a staff artist at the San Francisco newspaper, The Morning Call. By 1902, he was illustrating stories and covers for Sunset and Land of Sunshine, a Southern California literary magazine edited by Charles Lummis, a critic, a writer, and also an activist. He was also working for leading national periodicals like Harper's Weekly, so we see his work there on the left. Following the 1906 earthquake, which destroyed his studio, but also destroyed the offices of many of the magazines that he worked for, Dixon moved to New York, the center of commercial art production in the United States, and he was soon illustrating articles and covers for major national periodicals like McClure's and Scribner's. Like his mentor, Frederick Remington, Dixon worked in multiple media. He worked quickly, and he was extremely prolific, and these are all of the things that count when you're working in commercial art. He illustrated well over 80 books by authors including Jack London, that's an illustration on the left from the frontispiece, of Son of the Wild, maybe, I can't remember the London book on the left, books by Francis Parkman, The Oregon Trail, and Clarence Mulford, who wrote the Hopalong Cassidy novels, like Bar 20 Days. Dixon was well regarded among his mostly male cohort in the advertising world, and he was elected to the New York Society of Illustrators and the Salmagundi Club, a private, male-only social club named after a satirical 19th century literary magazine created by Washington Irving. Convinced that Western art, meaning American and European art, was in crisis due to the assault of modern art, both of these clubs promoted and privileged the purity of representational styles. So did the National Academy of Design, which hung two of Dixon's paintings in 1911 in its annual exhibition and purchased his painting Shapes of Fear in 1932. If art history privileges Dixon's paintings, he cut his teeth and he made his living as an illustrator. He was torn by this, he said, particularly as art world hierarchies insisted on distinctions between fine art and commercial art, and because art with a capital A was somehow supposed to be untouched and untainted by market concerns. Not that it ever is, and he lived a life in which he was constantly worried about and pursuing money, but these are the sorts of concerns that he was obsessed with, perhaps, at the time. In 1912, Dixon complained to his friend Charlie Lummis, "I'm being paid to lie about the West, the country I know and care about. I'm done with all that." It's writing from New York. "I'm going back home where I can do honest work in my own way." A few years later, he told an art critic at International Studio, "My object has always been to get as close to the real thing as possible. People, animals, country. The melodramatic Wild West idea is not for me. I aim to interpret, for the most part, the poetry, the pathos of the West, the life of Western people amid the grandeur, sternness, and loneliness of the country." This 1908 cover for Life, which was then a humor magazine that regularly published pictures by leading illustrators of the era, including Charles Dana Gibson, Palmer Cox, and Norman Rockwell, I think hints at Dixon's dilemma, this tug, this pull back and forth between commercial art and his feelings that I'm not painting the real West. We look at an old wizard who looks, sort of like Dixon, as an older man, gazing into his crystal ball, and he seems dismayed by the lithe, active figure of a naked woman that he looks at. Dixon returned to San Francisco in 1912, but he hardly abandoned art for hire assignments. Although most often identified as a painter of the American West, Dixon took on multiple commissions with diverse themes, including painting scenes of elves, gestures, and medieval merriment for the Jinx Room murals in mining heiress Anita Baldwin's estate in Arcadia, California. It's hard to believe, right? This is Maynard Dixon. In the 19-teens, he was an elected member of the Bohemian Club, the exclusive males-only club in San Francisco founded in 1872, and especially known today for its annual summer camp in Bohemian Grove in Sonoma County, where wealthy and influential club members get together for 2 weeks every July to drink and play and basically shape world policy. Dixon designed costumes for the club's annual theatrical productions in Bohemian Grove. So I show an example of this. These outdoor pageants that featured pyrotechnics and an elaborate ritual bonfire every year. He also illustrated collected editions of the club's Grove plays. So you get the point that I'm making here. He's really diverse in terms of the kind of art for hire assignment that he accepted. From 1916 to 1922, Dixon was employed by Foster & Kleiser, the San Francisco-based advertising firm that was the West Coast's largest billboard company, and I know we'll be hearing more about this in an additional paper. Focusing on dramatic narrative and storytelling, not just on selling specific products, the Pierce Arrow car or taking a trip on the railroad. He designed these kinds of billboards for cars, for car companies, for railroads. He designed this set of billboards for the Western States Life Insurance Company in 1922. And he designed this one for Golden State Butter in 1917. Look, I'm not sure what the dramatic narrative is here for this butter billboard, but it was apparently a huge success. very well liked, repeated, and butter sales went up. Lang later recalled in a 1968 interview that Dixon was Foster and Kleiser's top billboard designer at the time. Dixon himself credited billboard work with pushing him to rethink the composition and narrative of his canvases and his murals, remarking that it not only gave him, quote, new experience in design and color, but some working knowledge of areas and attention value. Also an insight into the publicity angle and customer psychology, a mighty valuable experience. We can see his shift here from the work that he did for billboards to the more capacious concept of design and enhanced color mass in the mural that he designed on the bottom there for Gillis Hall, California State Library in Sacramento. Interviewed in 1921 in the magazine The Poster, an illustrated monthly magazine devoted to poster advertising and poster art. And if you're confused by this repetitive use of the word poster, as I was, poster was the stand-in word for billboard and also for large-scale advertising. So this journal is really about, and it's all on Hathi Trust, it's all about who worked for the billboard companies all over the country. It's really an amazing resource. Anyhow, interviewed in 1921, Dixon related that the key to successful advertising was to generate clearly recognizable designs, meaning show the product, that also please the eye and touch the imagination and fancy. This was also, of course, the template for his paintings of the American West. The genre called the Western was born in the middle of the 19th century in the form of serialized story papers and then the dime novel. Story papers, like the one we see here, were cheap 8-page weekly newspapers that featured a few sequential and usually sensational tales, along with jokes, letters, and other miscellany. Okay, dime novels were similarly inexpensive and popular. First published in October of 1860, Beadle and Company's Seth Jones, or The Captives of the Frontier, sold over 600,000 copies at a time when book sales of 2,000 copies, for example, were considered really, really successful. It basically set the stage for the post-Civil War dominance in publishing and in a larger cultural, public, political, and visual imagination of heroic, male-centered narratives about the American West. The images accompanying these best-selling pulps enhanced their popular appeal, depicting the West as this dramatic frontier of mostly male, mostly white adventurers. Their vast numbers, including also multitudes of paintings, drawings, photographs, chromolithographs, all of them sort of engaged in this subject, helped to generate and perpetuate the American myth. As Joni Kenzie explains, visual images, as virtually no other medium could, helped make the American West imaginable. The Western was, by definition, a male-centered genre, a masculine genre, featuring male characters like these scouts on the cover of these Beadle dime novels, who were, and there's a definition of that, masculinity, laconic, charismatic, violent, and chivalrous. Interesting combination when you think about it. An emblem of secure manhood, observes one author. The genre of the Western emerged at a moment when masculinity supplanted manliness as the white male ideal, yielding more aggressive, more strenuous, more macho expectations of American manhood. Literary critic Jane Tompkins argues that the Western owes its popularity and its essential character to the dominance of women's culture in the 19th century and to women's invasion of the U.S. public sphere between 1800 and 1920. And for more on this dominance, I highly recommend Ann Douglas's classic study, The Feminization of American Culture, which analyzes the middle-class women, the writers of Victorian America, writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, the magazines they published in. We're looking here at Godey's Ladies book, which was published in Philadelphia from 1830 to 1878 and was the most widely circulated magazine before the Civil War, and the audiences who followed their every word. Countering the cult of domesticity, sentimentality, and spirituality prevalent in female-dominant 19th century fiction, and also challenging the politics of suffrage, the Western championed a rough-and-tumble, anti-emotional, and anti-woman America of galloping horses and hard-bitten men, facing danger and even death in dusty corrals, rugged landscapes, and barren deserts. Let's face it, it is more fun to write about the American West than it is about the feminization of 19th century American culture. Think of all the words that we can use, the wonderful adjectives. Simultaneously, the Western promoted the myth of the frontier and the ideology of manifest destiny, effectively serving the function of first reaffirming and then patrolling the borders of hegemonic masculinity, which is to say white, US-born, heteronormative masculinity. The Western centered on legend, which became mass-mediated memory through dime novels and movies. The Western was the first movie genre in American film. The Great Train Robbery, directed in 1903 by Edwin Porter, was the first feature-length film. Just 11 minutes long, it ended with the dramatic shot of one of the outlaws firing his gun at the screen and directly at us, much like the cavalry trooper who, Alan Braddock notes, shoots at the beholder in Schrevogel's Breaking Through the Line, which was painted just 3 years before Porter's movie. Dixon grew up, he later recalled, in a raw California boom town where men drank, gambled in land values, and shot one another over irrigation rights, which kind of helps to contextualize his production of Western pictures that look like this. He was the grandson of a former Southern plantation owner. He was the son of a Confederate Army officer. And after the war, the Dixon family joined an exodus of disaffected Southerners to California's San Joaquin Valley, where they attempted to recreate their lost plantation lifestyle on a Fresno ranch called Refuge. As a child, Dixon was often bedridden with asthma and voraciously consumed stories and pictures about a rugged, manly West. In 1877, when he was just 7, Beadle began publishing its half-dime library of books expressly written for boys. These half-dimes were both cheaper and smaller, allowing readers to fold them into quarters and to hide them behind their school books that they were supposed to be reading. So these are really smart. You know, it's a piece of paper, and then you fold it up into quarters, and then, of course, you're reading it behind what you're supposed to be reading. It was sneaky. It's also sensationalized. Merging projections of ideal masculinity with dynamic adolescence, many of the books and the story papers that were concurrently published featured boy heroes adventuring in a Western frontier, mythologized as a particularly open-ended space, especially meant for their individual self-fashioning. None of these books, none of these story papers ever told the story of how the American West, especially in the late 19th century, wasn't that open or available or accessible, certainly not to immigrant boys or boys of color or boys who didn't side eventually with the interest of big business and corporate capitalism. The era of the cowboy, after all, was brief, from 1865 to maybe 1895. After that, the cowboy was legend. From perusing dime novels and half-dime novels to studying Remington's illustrations, the Western was the genre that Dixon inherited, identified with, and yet also aimed to qualify over his long career. I'm not sure when he wrote this inscription or to whom. In this copy of Clarence Mulford's Bar 20 Days, the fourth novel in the Hopalong Cassidy series that he illustrated. But Dixon's comment after signing his name, "Yes, I was young and I knew no better," suggests that he was well aware of what the genre of the Western was and what its mythology of lone, manly cowboys free from social restraint and often involved in violent confrontation of nature and civilization implied in the thousands of pictures that he produced. Yet, the Western myth of independent, self-fashioned men persisted in his art, both in his pictures of white men and his pictures of Native Americans. If I've mainly focused on Dixon's pictures of white men in the West, I'd like to conclude with a consideration of his images of Native Americans, figures that he typically cast as spiritualized beings, more attuned to nature than other men. "I do not paint Indians," he told a reporter in 1913, "merely because they are picturesque objects, but because through them I can express that fantasy of freedom and space and thought which will give the world a sentiment about these people which is inspiring and uplifting." 2 decades later, he repeated these ideas in a description of Earth Knower. Quote, "He is a sage, calm Indian who stands against his own background of mountains, from which he draws his health, wealth, religion, and patterns of living." Dixon painted Native Americans, and Native American men in particular, as symbols of his own desires for freedom, for space, for inspiration. Looking at his painting, I'm struck by a different depiction of a Native American man standing against his own background of mountains. This is Alfred Hart's 1866 stereoscope of a Shoshone man looking at the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad from the top of Palisades, about 435 miles from Sacramento. All of the information written on the photograph itself. Hart was hired to document the western half of the first transcontinental railroad built from California to Utah from approximately 1864 to 1869. He photographed its daily progress, including its primarily Chinese laborers and the towns it generated, like Truckee, a notoriously xenophobic community on the California-Nevada border. The Shoshone, who lived near Truckee, were among indigenous tribes who resisted the railroad as it encroached on native lands, threatened native sovereignty, and destroyed wildlife and habitat. Hart's photo articulates a particular Western landscape, how it is being used, and the consequences of that utility. If Dixon painted Native Americans as stoic, timeless symbols, gazing toward some undefined and perhaps transcendent Western landscape, Hart depicted this man looking directly at the specific industrial and economic interests that fundamentally altered his patterns of living. He gave him agency, he gave him intent. My point is not to suggest that the one is better than the other. We live in different times. But that we look at Maynard Dixon's pictures, as we look at Maynard Dixon's pictures over the next few days, we take into consideration the broad sweep of sources and influences, popular literature, mass media, commercial art, his biography, his psyche, his personal interest, that helped shape and direct the masculine myth-making that he produced of the American West. Thank you.